IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. So today we have with us Rahul Matthan. Rahul is a partner at Trilegal and heads the technology, media, and telecom practice of the firm. So his expertise spans several sectors in the technology space, and he has been involved in a number of policy initiatives, including assisting the government in preparing the country's privacy law. He has also served on the Krish Gopal Krishnan Committee on Non-Personal Data and the RBI Committee on Household Finance. Rahul has written extensively on India's digital public infrastructure. His recent book titled The Third Way talks about India's unique approach to data governance, and our podcast today is based on this book. So welcome, Rahul. It's great to have you with us on ATP. And I also
Thanks. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, and I also have with me Rijesh, who is a research analyst with the High Tech Geopolitics program. And let's get started about your book. So your book is first question that pops to my mind is it's titled The Third Way, and it's India's revolutionary approach to data governance. So before we get started on the third way, what are the other two ways of approaching data governance?
Yeah, now this is obviously some sort of an arbitrary statement. I think different people have different ways of breaking up data governance. And just to highlight, Anu Bradford recently has a book where she has three ways of data governance, but India is not one of those three ways. So it's a world with different people having different lenses to it. My particular lens just comes from the way I've looked at it for the last 25 years or so, is that the origins of data governance is from the US, because the internet was invented there, and a lot of our early regulations come from what the US did at the time that the internet was created. That's fundamentally a laissez-faire type of an approach where the US government created Section 230, a very specific provision that didn't exist at the time. It was created essentially for the internet, that allowed technology companies, the companies that were the fledgling companies of the early internet, to decide how their users were to be regulated. Now, you've got to remember that this is a time well before the internet that we know right now. It was just a handful of people who were online. And so I guess it makes sense for the government to just take this hands-off approach to data regulation. But that sort of stuck. And it created this concept called internet exceptionalism, which is essentially that the internet is a sort of a different space, and companies that operate in the internet need to be treated differently from their offline counterparts. And that the people who will regulate what happens there is essentially the companies that are gatekeepers. Now, today, of course, we're all online. And as a result, the big gatekeepers, the big tech companies, are the ones that decide how data governance happens. That fundamentally is the US model. And the second model is the European model, which in many ways is a reaction to this US model. Unlike the US, where tech companies were allowed to pretty much decide how data governance takes place, in Europe, tech companies have to obey the rules and regulations that Europe puts down. So Europe is a very regulatory heavy, regulation-centric kind of an approach to data governance, where it is the government, in various manifestations. You have it in the data protection regulation. Europe has what is well recognized as the gold standard of data protection regulation in the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, but also in competition, in markets. There's a whole set of regulatory domains within which Europe exercises its jurisdiction over the market. So these are the two at the time that I write the book, these are the two types of data governance regimes that exist. And the basic thesis of the book is that India and India's DPI conceals within it a third way. And the book is looking at what the other two ways have done, sort of the pros and cons, and then bringing us to our current stage, where the idea is to just figure out at this stage, if these two aren't working perfectly, is it possible for us to find some other solution? And that's the proposal.
Right. So when we talk about India's third way, it's a lot to do with the different aspects of DPI that are being built out. And a lot of us are familiar with the identity and the payments layers of the DPI. But can you tell us a little bit more about the data empowerment and protection architecture, how it's being implemented, the possible use cases that it might have?
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about identity and empowerment and payments as two stages in the DPI journey, of India, but also if other countries are using it, or any country in the world. And the idea is really that when you get into this DPI journey, you start with access. You need to, if you're building a digital system for public services and public administration, you need to have some way to identify people on it. And that essentially is the key that unlocks your access into this ecosystem. And then once that happens, then you need to engage, because there are other people like you who are identifiable by the system. You can interact with them. And that essentially is where the payments ecosystem plugs in. These two, as you said, are familiar to everyone. But once you have operated in this sector for in this way for some time, you've interacted with the government, interacted with service providers, each other for a while. You then have laid down digital trails for a significant period of time. While it doesn't really matter to those who in the offline world have alternative means of gaining access to, say, capital or job opportunities or anything like that, in that sector of society that doesn't have easy access to this, people whose don't have the sort of physical collateral that's required for a loan. The idea is, can we use these digital trails to give them some sort of credit that they would otherwise not have been able to get? We realize that in the digital histories of people's transactions, it was possible to find the story of the creditworthiness of their business. If for a period of 10 years, you can see that a person has regularly earned such and such amount of money just by sort of watching the transactions, it should be possible, even if they don't have a certain piece of land or some physical collateral, to be able to say that, look, there is enough in their business, enough certainty that we can give them a loan. And that sort of information collateral, just the idea of monetizing or finding a way to extract greater value out of the engagement layer, all your actions in the engagement layer, led to this idea of data empowerment, which is sort of the third stage of the DPI journey. So what is this? Essentially, the idea is that all of these attributes of your transaction, the fact that you have conducted these transactions and various other pieces of information around it, that is currently contained in data silos. Usually, if you take the example of payments, your bank will have a statement. There could be other fintech entities that have a statement and a history of the things that you've done. That's not particularly useful, because unless that entity itself gives you a loan, and they very often are not incentivized to give you a loan, at least not in a competitive way, then that's not particularly useful. But is there a way to liberate this out of the silo and to perhaps share it with some other fintech that might be interested, or perhaps just try and find a market for this, to say that, look, I am on the lookout for the most favorable loan. I'm willing to share information that you need to give me the most attractive terms. And with my consent, can we do this so that you can then provide me a loan that suits my purpose. This is what DAPA does. So DAPA essentially connects data silos that have your data and sets up a consent-based mechanism whereby you can transfer this information to someone who asks for it. And in that process, you can create a greater value for yourself than would otherwise have been possible. Once again, as I said, not for all of us who have different access to different sources of real world traditional capital, traditional collateral, but for those who don't. And in the creation of this framework, in setting up the belts and braces that ensure that as we do this, we still protect the privacy of that person's personal data. We created a form of data governance that, to the best of my knowledge, has not been created elsewhere in the world, and in that lies some secrets to this new form of data governance that I am proposing under the third way.
Rahul, if you could just talk a little bit more about what you just ended on, right? The whole. So you've spoken in the book about some design principles for DPI and how you arrived at thinking about similar principles for governance, right? Basically, unbundling, interoperability, and federation. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that from the context of DPI and about how you think that helps in governing digital ecospaces.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll take them in no particular order, and if you want me to elaborate on one or the other, just let me know. But let's just start with unbundling. And I think one of the and just as a preface, this is not like a recipe. This is more a way of thinking. And so actually, it's just a really wide canvas in terms of how it's deployed. It doesn't have to be deployed in the context of DPI. It can be deployed in any other context. It's just a new way of thinking about data-related governance. So if you take unbundling to start with, the idea and the inspiration for that is that as we build out DPI, one of the characteristics of just the approach to building out DPI in India has been we just take the entire transaction apart to its atomic unit. So just think about UPI, for instance, right? The existing rails for payment, particularly. So the traditional rails of payment are it's your bank, and then your bank will issue a check, and then you've got this whole complicated system whereby checks will be cleared through a payment and settlement organization and those sorts of things. And then you also have Visa and MasterCard, which is a credit card system, which is sort of running on separate rails. Once again, does a very similar system. And when they looked at it, they just said, look, let's just unbundle all of this. Ultimately, what is a payment? A payment is an instruction to your bank to pay some other bank. And if you boil it down in that way, it is nothing more than a glorified messaging system. Because once you've got this messaging clearly sorted out, your bank, when it gets a message that it trusts, will essentially debit one account and credit the other account. And it's just an instruction to one bank to debit and another bank to credit. And if we can simplify it to that level, it should be possible to do this with radical simplicity. So that idea that if you can break things down to their atomic units, make transactions down to their atomic units, and then once you've done that, reassemble them, given what digital gives you. Digital gives you some sort of an auditable paper trail whenever you digitally sign something. It gives you the ability to retain records so that there is sort of proof for a long period of time. But perhaps most importantly, because it's capable of being self-executing, it allows you to complete this transaction end-to-end without any human interfering, in which case you can actually have greater assurance that this is a transaction that actually took place. So if you can break things down and then reassemble them in this way and give you these radical new products, the idea was, why can't you do that with governance as well? And where I'm coming from is that we tend to be very path dependent when it comes to coming up with governance frameworks. We look to see what worked in the past, and we sort of make a few tweaks and use that in the future. That, over a period of time, and sometimes even very quickly, leads to significant inefficiencies. And so the idea is each time we look to do some sort of a governance framework, can we break it all down and say, look, let's sort of write this entire thing from scratch? As a lawyer, in my firm, we're constantly using precedent documents. If you want to write the best contract, you will look to see some precedent document. Now, as we do that, as good as that is, because you don't have to rethink clauses. Someone has prepared this before, so you don't have to worry about having missed something or something like this. All that. The problem with that is you also tend to bring in a lot of the bad habits of the past. Something was put in there for some reason that is not perhaps germane to this new transaction that you're doing. But because it's there, you're like, look, what does it harm? Let's just keep it there. And that's how crud builds up and cholesterol builds up in the system. And I've seen this happen not just with contracts, but also with regulations, even with laws. And so the idea in unbundling for governance is, can we take a look at what it is we want to achieve and build it, break it down to its bare elements, and then put it back together in the most efficient way. And that's sort of the idea of unbundling as far as data governance is concerned. For federation, the idea was that I think there's this myth that digital systems need to accumulate all data in one place so that it can be governed, and that, of course, is one way to do it. But the DPI approach, for almost all the DPI, with the exception of the foundational ID system, which is sort of centralized for reasons that are actually quite obvious. You do want to ensure that the core identity, the core building block of digital systems, are kept in one place. But everything else is federated. So data is kept to the edges and is accessed as and when is required. And the idea behind federation is that if we can set things up such that we always keep data where it is, only pulling it when it is required, one, we reduce the surface of attack. And when it comes to digital systems, surface of attack is obviously a very critical thing. If you pool all the information in one place, becomes a honeypot, very easy to attack and cause harm to a lot of people. Whereas if you can keep it federated, at best, what they will get is just that piece of that part of the whole puzzle, and that's just a fundamental feature, I thought, for just being smart about the way in which you manage your data. But I guess for me, the most powerful element, and I spend the most time in the book on that design element, is this concept of interoperability and reusability. And if you think about the way DPI is built, DPI is essentially highly economical. If someone has built an identity system, any other DPI can rely on their identity system. And since it relies on the identity system, most importantly, does not need to build that system again. Which means that every DPI going forward just needs to say, look, I'm going to plug into whatever the identity system is. It doesn't have to be the foundational ID. It could be some sort of derived ID. But I don't have to worry about identity because that's a solved problem. There are APIs for authentication. There are people enrolled. I can just sort of get them on board with that. So that sort of idea of reusability was, I thought, a very interesting idea that DPI brought to the alternative, which is sort of the vendor-based model where vendors actually build the entire system from scratch. If you ask a vendor to build some sort of a system for you, they will actually build afresh the identity system, the payment system, the whole thing, because that's sort of the only way that they can work. So then I thought, can we look at this also from a governance lens? And what occurred to me was that in building these foundational systems, you actually embed in them a certain sort of a morality, a certain sort of an ethical framing that actually, if it's embedded into the foundational system, will infect every system above it. And the example that I sort of think is most appropriate to explain this is in designing Aadhaar, our identity system, we could have included some sort of a search feature. That would have been extremely convenient. People who want to find out if someone is who they are, they could just search the system and find out. And the problem, as convenient as that is, the problem with that is that it was not particularly privacy preserving. To allow people to search through the whole national database could have resulted in some serious privacy breaches. And we don't need to elaborate. And there's just so many ways in which that can go wrong. And so that was actually not even a feature that was built in. Today, what you can do is you can authenticate someone, provide your Aadhaar number, and it can say yes or no. Does it match the name? If you have a higher level of clearance, they could potentially ask some demographic information, but not much more. And you certainly cannot search. This is a very one-to-one kind of a corroboration, as opposed to a search to see if the person exists. Every system that builds on this foundational system is forced to adopt the same mechanism. So even if someone down the line wants to create a search, they can't, because the foundational system doesn't allow that. And I thought that concept, this concept of building reusable components into your governance, or ensuring that the core systems have these principles built in, will sort of virally affect every system that depends on it, forcing subsequent layers of the digital infrastructure to adhere to those principles and values that were created at the lower level in a way that, no matter what they do, they can't change. That I thought was an extraordinarily powerful way to think about it. I often get asked, what if these, if you build these DPIs for various governments, what if an autocratic ruler comes in? Can they misuse this system because you've built it this way? And the answer to that very often is actually exactly this. If the lowest level is embedded with the appropriate democratic ideals and values, and that is embedded deep enough into the ecosystem, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for an autocratic ruler sometime in the future to tinker with this and sort of change it, because it's so deeply embedded into everything that the system does. And that is actually a really powerful way to think about this. Of course, we've got to get it right. So the foundational layers have to have the right morality and the right philosophies built in. But once that happens, they become quite deeply rooted and embedded, and so can't be changed by whichever new ruler comes up and has a different approach as to how to do this. So those are some of the design principles that if you look at the way DPI thinks about these things, and then you try and see how that applies to governance, there is a sort of a correspondence and a match that we can use. That's the idea of that whole section, to elaborate on those sorts of ideas.
So, Rahul, if I could ask a slightly more philosophical questions based on what you've just told us, right? So, in essence, you're kind of talking about embedding, say, our values or policy choices within the technology, right? So, but today the way we develop our policies is through robust democratic debate in parliament. It's words and interpretations and representation from everyone, right? If you start embedding policy in code, then how do we ensure, or how do we make sure that there's still adequate representation?
So once again, it's layered, right? We have it's not that everything that every policy that we do is made in parliament. Laws are made in parliament. And then based on the laws, much of what is policy is regulation. Those regulations are bound by what is in the law, but the regulation is not debated in parliament. And then there are many subordinate levels of regulation, all of which are constrained by what has come on top. And so if you look at the waterfall of policy and legislation, right at the top of that waterfall is the Constitution. That was debated, now is actually very, very difficult to change. And that is sacrosanct. Below that, we have laws. Now, the laws have to abide by the Constitution. These laws are passed in Parliament with debate. And very often the debate actually challenges the laws on the grounds of the Constitution. But once all of that's done, then it goes down to the executive, which passes the various regulations that sort of go into into how these laws and then the constitution will actually work in practice in a particular sector. And that keeps going lower and lower down to administrative actions that are taken. This is not legislation. This is in the context of a very specific use case. Something happens. So I think that the what I'm describing actually fits somewhere in that lower level. When we can't be making policies from scratch, we can't be betting into these technology systems, things de novo that didn't exist before. What we can do is embed into this principles that have already been, in a sense, sanctioned. And those principles are now just reflected in code. And this actually is one of the core features of the third way approach for data governance that I, in a sense, elaborated early in the book, but sort of drove home towards the end of the book, which is that the US approach of doing things in this laissez-faire way didn't work, clearly, because companies respond to shareholder incentives, and that's not necessarily in the public interest. The European approach of issuing some sort of a regulation and that getting companies to comply with the regulation hasn't worked, because we've seen Cambridge Analytica, we've seen all sorts of things happen despite the regulation. And the reason why that happens, I argue, is because regulation really cannot work at the pace of technology. Regulation lags technology. By the time you see the problem and you issue the regulation, technology's already moved ahead. And so what we, I guess, need to do, and that's sort of the thesis of the book, is to have techno-legal regulation, where you have regulation that operates at the speed of code and is embedded directly into the code, so that you can regulate more effectively and more efficiently, particularly where we're talking about data. And so that's where this embedding, morality, regulations, laws into the code of the digital public systems is that's where that idea comes from. And I think it's almost inevitable that we have to do this, given that if we thought that the pace of technology change was fast, even we're recording this over the 2 days where the largest AI company has lost its CEO and the CEO has moved to another company, and this is how quickly the stuff moves. And this whole AI wave is basically 12 months old. So look, I mean, that's the speed at which things are going to move now. We really can't wait for the old regulatory way of doing things. We've got to find another more efficient way of doing data governance. So that's sort of the overarching thesis of the third way.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Rahul, so I want to come back from the philosophical discussion to more of an implementation level thing. So you spoke about how DAPA is used in enabling access to credit. But are there any other use cases? Like you see a lot of, like we're talking about AI. For training these AI models, for example, you might need a lot of data, or you might need data to be portable from one silo to another for it to be accessible, or for the end user to get a benefit from their data, right? So what would it take? First of all, is a system like DAPA compatible with this moving data from data of different types from one silo to another for training these algorithms, or for enabling new use cases for the user? Is that a possibility? And what would it take for something like that to be implemented? Because with finance, you already have a lot of these things built into DPI. So you have UPI and you have Aadhaar and all of these things. But for a different kind of use cases, there's something else that will have to be re-engineered, or how would that work?
Yeah, so look, the basic philosophy. So DEPA was started in the financial services sector, but it's completely applicable to just about any sector. It's applicable wherever data pertaining to an individual is stored in a silo, or some sort of a data set that's controlled by the person that collects and manages that data. But that person wants to move to some other person or entity. So to that extent, it's what I call a portability framework. And I use the word portability because this right to data portability is something well recognized under data protection regulation. This is essentially that. This is a right that an individual has over his or her data that is stored in a particular place. At this point in time, out of their control, but there is a recognition by law that this data pertains to this person, and so this person should have some right to take it out of that system, transfer it to some other system, etc., etc. So we can think of these sorts of use cases. Let's say skilling is I think a very powerful use case. You may have a set of skills that are recognized in one particular context, in perhaps a state where you lived. You migrate to another state, and you want to find a way in which you port that into whatever system works in this new state that you've come to. We've got to have a way to make that work such that people don't have to start afresh wherever they move. And we could see this also in health, for example. You want a second opinion. Right now, if you want a second opinion, you basically sometimes just have to get all your tests done afresh. Because the hospital where you did it, it just makes it so difficult for you to take your test results out that you might as well get it done afresh in this place. And that's also highly inefficient. Also, you lose the longitudinal history of what you have, and that's also not efficient. So certainly DEPA as a concept applies to a number of use cases. I said all this because I think one of the use cases it perhaps does not apply to as appropriately is artificial intelligence, and that's only because AI, at least in the training of AI, you want vast amounts of data, and this is not a sort of a mass portability system. This is not a system to port data en masse. This is a very individual specific system. So I, as a user, have data in data silo A that I want to move to data silo B. I can ask for that to be moved. This is not particularly useful for AI because AI doesn't want to do this one user at a time. It essentially needs vast amounts of users for the training cycle. Where this is potentially useful is on the inference cycle, where you've got trained data sets. You've got trained, the AI models are all have already been trained, and now you want to find some way to get some inferences. In order to do that, you perhaps, in some instances, need to get individual data that you can then present to these algorithms and have them do an inference on you. So it's more in the inference cycle than in the training cycle that I see DEPA being used. I think for the training cycle, we're going to need to find some sort of a workaround for non-personal data. As we look through the new DPDP, it's quite clear that the law itself applies only to personal data. So can we anonymize the data? Can we remove personal identifiers, take it outside the ambit of the data protection law, and then use that for the training cycle? We've got to start thinking along those sorts of lines in order to build out this AI ecosystem on the training side.
There's nothing in DEPA that stops, for example, a firm to join in the ecosystem as a data aggregator. So I could be a company that says, look, I'm a data aggregator that wants to create a mass data set of, say, Indian data, and I'm going to use DEPA to go, say at a retail level to aggregate the data and then sell it on, right? That is also possible. There's nothing in DEPA that stops that from happening.
So let me. Let me just say push back on 2 points. Right. One is you're going to have to do this individual by individual. Right. That's highly inefficient. And so if you want to do it individual by individual, yes, you can certainly do this. But then we come up on the second problem, which is that DEPA actually requires in the electronic consent artifact you to prescribe the purpose for which it is being used. AI training, in my experience, is best when it is purpose agnostic, because we really don't know what is going to come out of this training process that we've done. That's sort of the magic of this whole transformer model of neural networks and deep learning, that you put stuff in there, the weights do some black magic inside the black box, and you come up with these powerful use cases that very often are orthogonal to what we originally thought we would use this for. And so purpose limitation that is core to DAPA is actually going to come in the way of that. DAPA is also designed for minimal data collection. And we've got things like consent templates, which limit the amount of data by design that can be collected. Once again, antithetical to AI, which requires as much information as it can. And finally, this is revocable. So, if you've collected this information, given it for training, you're going to need to have to track that information. And whenever the user revokes it, you're going to need to have to pull it out of the data set and all the other attendant complications that are going to come with that. So if you ask me, yes, of course, it can be done, but it's extremely tedious to do this way. And there's much in the design of DAPA which will make this not the most efficient way to do what you're saying it can do. And as we think about this and talk through all of this, that actually is once again an example of how there is data governance that's built into this to prevent all of these things from happening. And we should perhaps reflect on that to say that perhaps we want AI; it's a good thing to do, but I can think of 100 ways in which this exact use case that you articulated could be used for some purpose that we don't want. And thank God for all of these elements that have been built into DAPA that will make it hard to do. Yes, we're not able to do the AI stuff that we want, but at the same time, there's a lot of other bad that you can't do because of this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so it's actually a feature and not a bug of the system that all of this is.
Yes, exactly.
And, so moving on, your book touches on some of the criticisms of DPI itself, and you try to answer some of these things. So I want to pick on one that you've written elsewhere also. Been some criticism about about coercion on the part of the government in driving DPI adoption, and how without this it would not be where it is today. And to just set this in context, so India is leading the world in innovation in DPI. And it looks like a lot of other countries are going to adopt it as well. But this is not the case in other areas where India is seen as typically lagging on the innovation front. So with DPI, what seems to be the case is that you need a lot of diverse groups to come together to make it work. So it might be regulators, banks, tech companies, individuals, and so on, right? So it might be difficult for the market itself to address it. You've written about how this coercion or market orchestration, as you've termed it, might be necessary, especially for lower middle income countries, to build out something like this and to achieve these gains in improving development outcomes. So to what extent is this necessary for the government to intervene in this way, and can the market itself kind of find alternatives like this or address these build these ecosystems?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's not that market orchestration is an essential element of all DPI. But at least in our experience in India, and over the last couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, I've been sort of taking a look at how this happens elsewhere in the world as well. And at least in the initial phase, market orchestration is sort of necessary. And the reason I say this is because it's a complex thing that DPI is setting out to do. DPI is setting out to achieve some sort of a market outcome, which is often a public policy outcome. This is what we want to do, but to do it by co-opting the private sector. The private sector is notoriously only interested in doing what is good for its shareholders and not generally for the market. But there is sort of a middle path where we can explain to the private sector that in the long term there is a shareholder value in doing such and such. That may require orchestration. it's not obvious to shareholders who have like a quarterly horizon on achievements. They need to quarter on quarter report some sort of improvements, and a lot of these DPI outcomes have decadal kind of impact. You won't see that impact unless you're willing to wait a decade. That's not the time horizon that any private sector entity would like to play in. It is for this that there is some level of orchestration that is appropriate, where by actually creating some sort of systems, some sort of outcomes that they are constrained to follow, that you can achieve this overall goal. So I mean, it's possible that as DPI is proven to be successful, as this approach is proven to be successful, we will in the future require less and less orchestration. At least I'm seeing that is the case already. The latest, I guess, version of DPI is ONDC, which is our Open Network for Digital Commerce. Given the amount of time it took for people to get interested in UPI, if you see how quickly people are adopting to ONDC, you can already see that there is less and less orchestration required. There is a sort of a fundamental belief that over a long enough time scale, that some of these approaches can bear fruit. And I think that is sort of the shift that will happen, which will call for less and less orchestration. Then, and I think different countries have demonstrated some sort of orchestration that is similar. For instance, Brazil, in the adoption of PIX, it was made mandatory. The government just sort of said, look, all the banks now need to be using this fast payment system. That is market orchestration, essentially the government stepping in. I mean, it's a great thing they did, because when you go to Brazil now, you see beggars with cardboard signs begging for money, saying that, look, I don't have any place to live, and they have their PIX number written under it because that's the way they want to receive the money. So you can see how that little bit of a nudge is required to move people into a completely new paradigm of thinking. But at least I believe that over a period of time, market orchestration, the need for it will come down as there is greater faith in this approach.
Right. So moving on to the privacy and surveillance concerns around DPI. In your book, you have a chapter dedicated to these concerns. And you've already touched upon how having a federated system kind of addresses some of these concerns, or minimizing the data that's collected is also a way of addressing it. Can you talk a little bit more about how other ways in which DPI is built, in which all of these considerations are addressed? And also in the context of the exceptions carved out for the government under the new Personal Data Protection Act, how does this play with how DPI is implemented? How do these exceptions enable the government or restrict the government when it comes to data?
Yeah. So look, let me answer the first question first. So this goes back to that whole idea of federation. Now, one of the biggest disadvantages to surveillance is not having all the data in one place. If you have all the data in a single centralized place, it is much easier, just as a practical matter, to conduct surveillance. If, on the other hand, you have to go data silo by data silo to try and find information about a person, no matter how efficient you are, that is actually going to come in the way of effective surveillance. And the way in which India's DPI has been built is very much emphasizing the latter. I'm not saying that this is designed to prevent surveillance. It is generally a smarter thing to do when it comes to data, to not put all the data in one place, to create a honeypot, to create one single point of vulnerability. So for all of those reasons, it's separate. But it just so happens that also makes surveillance very difficult because surveillance agencies actually would like to have it all in one place. I mean, if you look at the historical examples of data surveillance, the NSA ran all the telecommunication data through centralized pipes. And that's how they were able to do the sorts of things that Snowden said that they shouldn't do. fundamentally they design their systems to actually bring data into a central location, and DPI is designed to keep it separate, to keep it as far away as possible. So, to me, I think that is the core argument against this contention that DPI will be used for surveillance. It is possible that some elements of DPI assume such great significance that you will be able to start to infer things at large enough scale, but it's certainly not as much as if it was all concentrated into a single place. This then leads me to the second question around the exemptions. Now, the exemptions, I think, on themselves and without DPI, would give the government the ability to do some sort of surveillance, or to do some sort of essentially to access information without your consent or without your knowing it, to in a way that is excessive. But since DPI systems have been built in this federated way, even with that, the ability to access it, the fact that it is inconvenient to access information, if you think about the total amount of data that is collected through all of these systems, it is a nice large amount that any surveillance organization would like to have. And now with the DPDP exemptions, arguably they could have it without any further checks and balances. But because the systems have been built like this, even armed with this carte blanche, they will find it difficult to get access to it. Or at least more difficult than had it all been centralized. And I think that really is the central argument around it. And we all know that the problem with the exemptions are there are circumstances that are acceptable for where it is acceptable for the government to exercise this exemption. We can think of the most extreme things, and at some point in time, no matter how libertarian we all are, there will be a point in time where we say, okay, now at this point it's okay, whatever that is, and we will all have different points, and I don't want to get into that. But therefore, if that is the case, then there is a case for the exemption, and I think the argument against the exemption is perhaps that the government will find a point that neither of us agree is the correct point, and that's not okay. But if you agree that there's a point, then you agree that there's logic for the exemption. Having said all of that, if we've embedded this into the DPI, we can, in many ways, make it difficult for that point to be flagrantly violated, and I think that itself is. As you said, Rijesh, that is a feature, not a bug of the system. And in a way, it's belts and braces in the system. Of course, if we can get into the system and tweak that and sort of loosen this up, allow for the greater consolidation of data into a single place, we will be getting into trouble. But the longer these systems operate in the way that they are, the greater is our experience that it is actually relatively easy to get data from wherever it is rather than putting it in a central place, the less is the incentive to try and centralize the data. If we can access it very quickly from where it is, why put it all in one place? What's the incentive to do that? Particularly if it's working really well over a long period of time. So I would say that these sorts of things are things that, if not now, certainly in the long run, once this has been demonstrated to work at scale over a long period of time, would be a good way to think about this.
Yeah.
Well, just staying on the privacy bit for a piece, right? Not talking about governments here, but somewhere in the book you also spoken about this idea that even if we can guarantee that your data is moving in a proper way, there's really no way for DEPA to ensure that what somebody's doing with your data, right? And so in relation to that, you've written about this idea of confidential clean rooms as a place where compute and data can sort of come together and it'll all be done cleanly. So I'm kind of curious about that idea, like, and who do you, in your mind, who is a good person to be building a confidential clean room or a compute kind of a system?
I don't think that there's any one person who should do it. I think, we should just have this idea of a confidential clean room, and maybe I just spend a little bit of time explaining where I'm coming from with this idea to then see how we can apply it. But essentially, the problem that you articulated and the problem that I articulate in the book is that we can do a lot to specify the purpose, to specify how long is retained, all of these things. But once the data is in the hands of the data consumer, the person to whom it is transferred, there is, in this current world, there is no mechanism by which you can ensure that that person does what he or she promised with the data when they collected the data. Now, to be clear, this is not a new problem. This is a problem that exists even today. GDPR requires all of these things. Various companies promise all these things in the privacy policies that we all sign. And then time and again, we found that they've done something completely different. Either they worded the privacy policy in such an inventive way that we thought we were signing up for something and it was like broad enough for something else, or they just flagrantly did whatever they want. And that's the whole problem. Once the data is in their hands, there's no way you can prevent them from doing that. And so the problem is, how do we ensure that we give them the data? Because we certainly do want to give them the data for what it is they promised they will do with the data. We take the example that I spoke about earlier. Information collateral could be used to give me a loan. But if that information collateral, once it's been used to give me a loan, is used to upsell me on something else, or to just constantly harass me with sales calls for some new product or service, that would be not in accordance with the purpose. And so the idea of a confidential clean room is a computational space. Just think about it as some sort of a data room where you can put your data. A person who is promised to give you a loan can run their algorithms or whatever it is they want on the data. The algorithm spits out an answer. That answer is either yes, he's eligible for a loan, or no, he's not eligible for a loan. And once that answer comes out, the data in that clean room is deleted or returned back to the person or whatever. How do we computationally guarantee this? And there are systems today that can create this on an automated basis. So if I was to send my data to a fintech to ask them for a loan, what I would do is not give the data to the fintech itself, but put the data into this confidential clean room. The fintech would then be allowed to run algorithms on it, but not actually see the data, because it doesn't matter to them what specific transactions I did. They just want to know, have I done 200 transactions, each of a value of more than 10,000 rupees? And then their algorithm will say, if those two are checked, then yes, we can give them a loan of 2,000 rupees. I mean, I'm making this up, but that's sort of the way in which this will work. In which case, once that has happened and they're reasonably assured that they got this data, this outcome, this analysis out of data which is accurately identifiable to me, and it's not just someone else's data that's come, that should be enough for them to be able to provide me with a loan. And then after that, they don't need the data and we can delete this. If we can create something like this, we will prevent that entity from taking the data they collected from me for the purpose of evaluating me for a loan, and then reusing it to sell me some products later, which would be a violation of the purpose limitation obligation. So this is a way to do it. Now, your question is a question that, quite frankly, I don't have an answer to at this point in time, but I think an answer is we can get it. We need to find incentives to ensure, we need to find the correct incentives to ensure that the entities that are creating these confidential clean rooms are creating them in a way that will not abuse the trust that the data principal who has given, to whom the data pertains, and has put the data into the clean room is not abused, right? We should make sure that this person who is setting up this confidential clean room does not give the data consumer, the fintech company that's analyzing this data, some sort of a backdoor to actually get into this information. And how do we do this at scale? How do we set up regulatory safeguards? How do we set up appropriate incentives, commercial incentives, business model incentives to do that? All of this is sort of, to my mind, a work in progress. This is sort of the things that we need to be thinking about. But let's be clear that this sort of a model offers a technology solution to a very, very thorny problem, decades old problem in data protection regulation, which is how do you prevent someone from using it for a purpose that was not intended? And once we can do this, particularly in a world where everything is happening digitally, everything is digital data. If we can do this right, we can actually get to a point where we can for the first time implement the use limitation obligation that has just sort of been written in law, but just our history of data regulation around the world shows that more often than not, that use limitation obligation has been breached.
Right. Thanks, Rahul. This has been a really insightful conversation. So, just any concluding thoughts on, say, where do you think this third way is going to take us, and how do you see what role do you expect to play in our lives, say, 10 years from now?
Look, this is not a new idea. As I write in the book, probably the first book on if there's a popular science equivalent for law, this book is the very first book of that genre that was written by Lawrence Lessig. It was called Code and the Other Laws of Cyberspace. This is like a book that's been written, almost 25 years ago. And it said exactly the same thing. It said the same thing at the dawn of the internet, and it says that on the internet, code will be law. And so whatever you want, whichever way you want the internet to be governed, you've got to write those laws into the code of the internet itself. We never did that. So it's 25 years on. We're now at a place where I think digital has blurred the boundaries between what was traditionally done only offline and now what is done either offline or online, largely online. And it's got to the point where we really need to think through some of these solutions. We haven't done it for the last 25 years, but this is the time to do it because almost everything that we do has a digital component. I mean, in India, no one uses cash for anything. No one uses credit cards for anything. Everyone uses digital payments. Whether it is to give a valet attendant a tip, or whether it is to buy some large significant purchase, it's all done using digital payments. And if that is the extent to which DPI has or technology has pervaded into our regular offline lives, we need to find a different way to govern it than the way that we've been doing in the past. So I would like to think, whether it follows the exact outline that I've stated in the book or some completely different outline, that this idea that we should start thinking of embedding democratic values and principles, or autocratic values, whichever one you want, whatever you align to in your country. But if you can think of embedding that directly in code, that is the way in which this is going to, this world is going to go forward. I think the approach of, I guess the big lesson of this is the approach of using laws to regulate the world, and using only laws to regulate the world, needs to change. We need to have a rethink of that, because when so much of the world is digital and tech enabled, we need to have an additional set of levers to regulate that world. What it will call for is for governments to change the way in which they are designed, for policy thinkers to change the way in which they're designed. I don't think anymore it is an option to be ignorant of these sorts of levers, to be ignorant of the ways in which these things are designed and operate. Because if you want to contribute to the regulation of any aspect of the world going forward, you're going to need to have in your arsenal of different tools, regulatory tools that you can use to achieve certain outcomes. You need to have in your arsenal some of these tech tools. It used to be that you needed to know law and economics to be able to do vast majority of policy. I argue that now you will also need to know these sorts of technology levers, where you can embed code into the actual technology. And it's almost going to be inevitable. You're going to need to skill yourself in this way if you're going to be able to participate in the data governance and in general any governance in the next decade or so.
Thanks, Rahul. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And for our listeners, I think your book is a great resource to understand digital public infrastructure and how it works, how it impacts your life. So do check it out. It's called The Third Way, and it's just launched a month ago. And thank you for the insightful conversation.
Thanks so much. Pleasure being here. And I'm glad you engaged with the book so much. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.